Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and today I'm going to try something a little bit different on the channel. See, I cover a lot of games, and not just the games that you see here on YouTube in my typical indie game review form. You know, highly edited, very scripted. I do a lot of indie game coverage over on Twitch, and even non-indie games. In this case, a AAA game for once, Sonic Frontiers. Now, this will not necessarily be a trend in terms of covering bigger games. I'm still the indie game guy. But every once in a while, a game comes along that I do want to cover from the AAA space, especially one that I have a connection to, which Sonic definitely fits in that area. But rather than do a structured review that would take maybe another 2 or 3 weeks, which actually would take 4 to 5 as my parents are coming down, hopefully in the next week, and I'll be on vacation for 2 weeks, I wanted to do sort of a stream of consciousness of what I feel about the game. I'll still edit a little bit here and there and show you clips that make sense in context to what I'm talking about, but this is more free form. This is coming off the top of my head and what I feel about the game, and maybe give you the information you need to make a decision about it, but not necessarily in a tight format. If this format works, I may be able to do this more with indie games that I stream that, you know, maybe I can't do a full review on, because I do usually full reviews on games that I get keys for or something along that line, but more so give more information on a more consistent basis. The atmosphere around Sonic Frontiers right now is very hit or miss. Some people absolutely love the game and think it is the future of Sonic. Some people absolutely hate the game and think the game is absolutely crap. So, what do I think? Well, I'm sort of in the middle, leaning towards good, but there's one specific element that I want to start off with. I believe more than the last couple iterations, with the exception of something like Sonic Mania, specifically focusing on the 3D Sonic portion, I think that Sonic Frontiers provides a basis and a template for the future of Sonic. Now, does it always work in Sonic Frontiers in terms of quality? No. The quality in terms of every moment-to-moment gameplay, story, atmosphere, it's all over the place in Sonic Frontiers. There are some very high highs and there are some very low lows. But when I look at the core exploration, movement, and just overall gameplay sense here, I think that this is a great idea for Sonic going to the future. I think it makes a lot of sense. Using Sonic's speed, Sonic's exploration and movement to really explore this environment makes a lot more sense to me than even something like Breath of the Wild. Don't get me wrong, Breath of the Wild is the better game overall. But for a fan of the series in terms of Zelda, I didn't necessarily like the open world structure as much. I really liked dungeons and sort of more contained experiences. But for Sonic has always been about the movement, always been about, you know, hitting precision in terms of jumping from one thing to the next and getting through a level without necessarily, you know, falling off a platform. But even if you did, you'd still be able to go forward in some sort of way or go back a tiny bit. I felt that games in the Sonic franchise that have really resonated with me, Sonic Adventure 2, some of the older Sonics, Sonic Mania, every level and every experience has a rhythm to it. There is a sort of back and forth where, you know, you jump from one platform to the next, and it's almost, I don't want to say rhythm game-like, but it has a natural flow to it. And one of the first things that I noticed about Sonic Frontiers that really made me enjoy the gameplay when it was doing fantastic is the exploration and collecting of items within these little subworlds that you first are introduced to. When you're first going around the map and you are collecting items in terms of like the keys that you need to unlock the Chaos Emeralds, the medals you need to give to your comrades to sort of free them, the game has this rhythm of just doing one thing to the next. not having a specific task per se. Yeah, you got that task in the corner and you need to do that. But after the first world, you realize, oh, I'm going to need 50 medals in order to be able to do the first couple. So let me just collect everything. And the rhythm of going from one task to the next, running through, just sort of running after it and going to the next one is fantastic. It is freeing in a lot of ways in terms of just enjoying this world that's being constructed. What's weird about this is that when it comes to open world games and that kind of format, I'm actually not a big fan of it usually. Games like Skyrim, I understand that there's a little bit of structure and it gives you a little bit of an open world. Things like Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a good example. But sometimes I want to be pushed in a specific direction and have a specific task, and it almost overwhelms me in terms of some of the open world stuff. But here, this open world, because the tasks, yeah, you had to do them, but there were multiple ways of usually doing them in terms of collecting the items you needed. It was more relaxed. It was more free-flowing. And I really think that when it comes to Sonic, that makes a lot of sense. He is the sort of character that is not necessarily cool and just laid back. He is the hero after all. He is the sort of central protagonist. But it makes sense for the sort of too cool for school mentality that Sonic usually has. That works well. But it's the other direction where things start to fall apart in terms of the overall overworld designs that Sonic Frontiers starts to struggle with. See, if I'm going in the direction where the pads are, boosting me in that direction, everything's fine. But when I want to get to a specific point on the map, and I'm fighting the natural flow in terms of the direction that the game wants me to go, that's when the game starts to struggle, where it's really sort of fighting you in terms of your task, and it's some of the least enjoyable parts of the game, in my opinion. Let me take an example here. You're going through the map, you're collecting things, and you've realized that you've got a bunch of attack and defense seeds that you can give to this one guy to upgrade. So you want to go to a specific point on the map to turn them in. Well, you're sort of then fighting some of the flow at times. Sometimes you have open areas where that's not a problem. You can, dodge boost pads and you can deal with that issue. But sometimes you have very constricted areas that force you to go into very narrow corridors or very specific paths because there are like an island set up. And that's when the game starts to get frustrating for me, because sometimes finding those paths that you need to go, even if you've been there before, can be horribly frustrating, because some of this map design doesn't really have good landmarks or good ways of identifying, hey, hold on a second, where am I in subject to everything else on the map without necessarily bringing up the map. A prime example of this is the level 2 area and the middle of the map, where there are these very narrow corridors of rocks that have you go into these sort of ravines that you run through. They are very labyrinth-like. They are winding, and within that sort of structure, it all looks the same. Sure, in the middle you have sort of this like temple-like area, but beyond that, you sort of get lost very easy because one corridor seems very similar to the next one. Some certain like landmarks or very distinct elements within the structures could have easily told me, oh, I know that this is the north part of the map because it has a specific symbol or something like that. But instead, you end up being frustrated because you went down the wrong corridor, and now you gotta sort of backtrack, and now you're running back through things, and now you're getting even more confused. And yeah, that's frustrating as hell, especially for someone who doesn't like open world experiences as much as other people in this genre. This is a great microcosm of what I feel about every element of this game in terms of not only just the presentation, the story, but the gameplay as a whole as well, is that it has very great parts, but then something drags it down, especially when you go a little bit off the beaten path, or there's some element that doesn't feel as refined as everything else, and it ends up showing up in ways that really irritate you because it repeats because it is a huge world, open world experience. A good example of this is the shrine challenges to unlock sections of the map. When the shrine challenges, in my opinion, are great, they are ones that I want to find the next one just to do the puzzle or the element in question. Good example are these sort of square tile puzzles here, where you have to step on them one by one to, turn them off, and you have to do them all without necessarily touching any of the dark ones. And these are great. Yeah, it's a simple puzzle, but these puzzles are quick, they're easy, but it makes you think a little bit and challenges you in different ways in terms of your perception. That's good. That is the kind of thing that I want to see from these challenges. Now, that is more of a traditional puzzle element that you would see in other games like this, but let's take a more non-traditional element that Sonic has put in here. These sort of orbs that you have to fire into these rings, similar to something like soccer. You're throwing the ball into the goal. At first, it looks really simple, especially with the first one or two challenges. You knock the ball into it and, okay, you get it unlocked. But then it goes into the later game, and you start getting angles that you have to hit the ball at very specifically in terms of setting up Sonic, a certain amount of feet away from the ball, a specific angle above or below the ball. And that's the kind of stuff that I love to see because it makes the player think. The player does have the tools necessary in order to get over the challenge, but it's not necessarily frustrating to a point where it would push them off the game. In fact, you could sometimes get through these with a little bit of luck and a little bit of perseverance. And for an open world game like this, I think that's fantastic. Those feel like they're Shine to a Sheen, where they are the best example of what the game has to offer. But then there are the other shrines. The shrines that, and I'm going to be frank here, feel like they were last-minute additions. The Simon Says puzzle, sort of, kind of, not really. You hit left and right with the glowing element on the screen, and that's it. That's all you do. Even if you get it wrong, it doesn't matter. You can just go to the next one, and you have enough time to always do it. I'm not sure what this is testing. The fact that I can hit the button left and right on the screen? Or even worse, the parry one. Because at first you're like, oh, I have to do timing, and maybe later on I have to do even better timing. Except you don't. All you need to do is hold down the button once it starts firing at you, and it will auto go back to it. So I have to hold the L1 and R1 button to complete the task. That's it. Riveting gameplay. Now, it would be very easy to look at some of these experiences and some of the jankiness of certain elements of the game, where the game's camera, for example, doesn't feel as refined as some other open world experiences, and claim that the game may have come out a little bit too early. And I get where the people are coming from in certain elements of that. When you compare some of the design elements, especially with these shrines, it does feel like certain things were rushed. With that said, does it make it a bad game? No. It just means that you definitely feel the valleys along with the peaks. And for some people, you do enjoy the peaks a little bit more when you come from a valley. But for some people, when you're hitting valley after valley because you ran a certain way, the experience can come off a little bit inconsistent or even bad. And that's something I want to be very specific on. The experience you have is going to be entirely based on how you play the game. If you're a more structured person in terms of always following exactly what the game is telling you, go here, go and do this specific thing, you're probably going to have a little bit more of a harder time with the game, because the game is best when it's free-flowing, like I said. But if you're somebody who's just wanting to run around at Sonic, you're probably enjoying this game a lot more because there's so many different opportunities to do that. With that said, I will admit that this game did remind me of something in terms of some of the smaller details when it comes to the animations, the mini games, and some of the focus on the story. And I know I'm going to get a lot of shit for this, but it reminded me of another Sega product, Yakuza of all things. When completing certain quests, you get this sort of dance from Sonic, and he is able to hold up a Chaos Emerald, and for some reason that felt very, cut in like you see with Yakuza minigames to me. But more so things like the Sonic eyes cut in, where it focuses on his eyes and his eyes alone, especially during the fishing minigame. It just felt very, very strange to me, and it felt like it was trying to give it a little bit of style, but didn't know exactly how to do it, and thus, it chose that. Now, do I think Sonic is trying to become Yakuza Light? No, not at all. But I do think it looked at some of the presentation elements of Yakuza, in particular with the minigames and some of the character elements, and tried to adapt it to Sonic Frontiers, and for the most part, I think it did work in terms of the presentation and flair portion. Now, I could be completely wrong on this, but it just reminded me a lot of Yakuza, and I can't get that out of my head. I think the game needed that after something like Sonic Forces. That serious story, that story that was about almost all-out war, ended up being a little bit goofy in terms of the presentation because it was so serious and it didn't necessarily focus on certain things that I thought it should in terms of flair and the Sonic universe. In fact, I think Sonic is a laid-back character that, yes, does get serious at times, but the sort of goofiness is inherent to Sonic at its core, at least in my opinion. Which is why it is so weird to me that the story director went in a specific vision for the voice actors and their performance in this game to not take advantage of Sonic's cartoon nature. The fact is, Sonic has always had a goofy element to him. Whether it be the old 80s, 90s cartoon where he was, that rad hedgehog that had those quips, or maybe the more serious versions that existed in the comics. Yes, he was serious and he had jokes, but he would put out quips and have that sort of tone where, yes, he was taking things seriously, but not too seriously. And that still exists here, except in the voice performance. A lot of the tone and a lot of the actual performance when it comes to most every character here feels monotone, which is strange because these actors have been with these roles for a long time. When Sonic should have a little bit more pep in his voice or a little bit of a sort of Cheshire Cat nature to the response that he's giving, it's not there here. It feels like a soap opera, and with this plot, that doesn't work. Yes, you have characters having serious interactions with each other, but they feel hollow in most cases because they don't feel like the characters that we have come to know. It's even more strange when you think about Sonic in the actual media landscape lately. The fact is, the last two Sonic movies, the real-life yet not real versions, did absolutely gangbusters for Sega and everybody involved in it. And that was more kid-friendly. There were some jokes in there that some people may have felt were juvenile, but it worked. The overall presentation of that Sonic character was somebody who was a little bit different from the Sonic that we knew in certain cases, but still felt familiar. And this Sonic, I don't know, this Sonic just doesn't feel the same to me, especially with the actual voice acting performance. Now, I do not put that on the voice actor, because I know this voice actor, he's done so many versions of Sonic, has that capability to pull that off. I put this on the game director / story director, because they obviously had a vision that didn't even match the writing, and that's just weird to me. These inconsistencies, to me at least, point to the management of the game, and I see that management falling apart at several elements in terms of putting pieces together, the presentation, the story, and the gameplay all together to make sure that the experience is sublime. Take, for example, this boss fight. This boss, you have to go around on these rails and highlight them all the way so that it opens up the weak point of the boss. Now, you have to dodge things in order to not take damage and lose your rings during this, and in concept, this really does work. Except, a frustration happens because of the design of the actual visual elements as well as the character design of the boss itself. It's spider-like, and it has these huge legs that plant it into the ground. The problem is, as you go around the circle, you will go around and see these legs which block your field of view at times. You won't be able to see what's upcoming, especially in the second and third phases of the fight, which leads you to jump onto maybe one of the rings that you really weren't supposed to grind on them, and you end up taking damage. Punishing the player for the design here doesn't make a lot of sense when there are ways that you could have avoided that. You could have made the legs semi-transparent as you went around that particular section, at least in the foreground, to make sure that the player could see everything that was happening. Or hell, you could have even taken the character design and make it like sort of leg rockets so that they broke apart so that you could easily, clearly see the rings. Instead, you sort of took the design and just sort of forced it in there without putting into account how the gameplay element would come into play. And that leads to a mishmash, and that happens more often than you want in this game. I will say that one of the things I did appreciate, even though there were some struggles at times, the boss fights in terms of the main Titan bosses actually worked pretty well for me. Yes, they were a little bit over the top and a little bit too, what's the word I'm looking for, anime for my taste in terms of some of the music and choices made here. But this did feel like Sonic taking on a huge enemy and feeling like it was appropriate to Sonic's character, and particularly Super Sonic. It did do the story element in terms of feeling like all you have done to gain the Chaos Emeralds made a difference in these fights. And while I feel like the ring element being health and not necessarily knowing that going into it was a little bit strange to me, it does make sense from a gameplay perspective, and yeah, it does work in the overall picture. Sonic Frontiers gave me a lot of whiplash. I would have a boss fight and absolutely love it. Then I would get a level like this, where the controls felt sluggish. You were supposed to be able to control Sonic and how he goes around these corners with the left stick, but it felt like I was controlling Sonic with like molasses all over my hands. And it's a little bit different from all the other stages that you have in the sort of shrine elements in the game, but it just comes out of nowhere, and it feels like this wasn't given the sort of dedication like the boss fights were. And it stands out as an experience that maybe this was a prototype of some levels that they maybe wanted to do more of, and the fact is it didn't work, so it's now just one. And I don't understand why it's here, because it feels so off. It's such a low compared to the highs that I'm almost like tripping over myself trying to talk about it. Or that's just me talking, because I trip over myself all the time unless I have a script, and there's no script in this video. On the flip side, I do like the fact that the game does have a bunch of variety in the main quest line and main actions. The fact is that you have things like this, where you're collecting all these screws in a limited amount of time. And even the stages that are more classical Sonic do have good variety in terms of the navigation paths and everything along that line. It isn't a standard template here that they repeatedly use over and over again in the main quest line. In the open world with some of those other things, yeah, they do, but here, not so much. And I do appreciate it. I just wish that some of the repetition that happens in the open world, well, it was replaced with some more things like this. Going off on a tangent, though, I understand that every Sonic game has these little creatures that they introduce, and while I would like some consistency, maybe reusing Chows for example, I do appreciate that they gave a little bit of personality to some of them, like the goggles on this one. But to completely go off the rails, Sega, why don't we have a Chow Garden game? Like a phone game? I understand it would be probably microtransactions left and right, but everybody I talk to who loves Sonic loves the Chow Garden, and I don't understand why Sonic hasn't brought it back in some form. I mean, it's the one thing that I consistently hear saying, yes, we need more of this, and yet they've never gone back to it. What's up with that? One thing that I'm having trouble getting over in terms of the open world design, however, is that a good amount of the time I'm not listening to the best Sonic music that I could be listening to. The fact is that when it comes to the stages, and in particular the boss fights, that's when the music is the best in Sonic Frontiers. Especially some of the lyric portions, which, yeah, they could be a little bit cringy at times, but it works for the game. But in the open world, when it's this sort of generic exploration music, it doesn't work for me. It does work when the music sort of kicks up in terms of, finding a mini boss and the music starts to, really get into it and you realize that, oh shit, things are going down. But when you're just sort of exploring the world, it's sort of dull. Finally, I haven't really talked about the combat in-game, and this is where I am the most perplexed in terms of it works for me, and yet I'm sitting there going, eh. So what I mean by that is the core combat in terms of the combos and things like that, it doesn't work for me. I'm going to be honest with you. It feels very repetitive. Yes, you wait for your time to be able to attack things, and you have certain skills that are able to get past defenses, but a lot of the time you're just smashing buttons over and over again. And the funny thing is that it is sort of side by side with the sort of drawing ability of Sonic that they've added to the game. This ability to sort of go around the enemy and cause the circle to do a guard break or damage. And that portion is where the combat is at its best, because it leads to really using Sonic's sort of speed in the heat of battle, and it really feels very unique to Sonic. We've seen drawing elements in games like Okami before, but I really wish it was just this. Like, you have to draw a certain element in order to break it or just do damage over and over again. Because I did that, and then I would have to just, let me hit the L2 button or the R2 button, or just hit square a bunch of times. The actual positioning and actual drawing element, I think they can refine that for the next game and really take the combat to a whole new level. And I really hope they do, because in the end, it's probably one of the more standout features that are unique to Sonic Frontiers. As for the technical side of things, from a performance perspective, it's fine. It keeps a stable frame rate, and while people have complained about the textures and some of the quality of the textures, I don't necessarily find that to be a very big selling point on Sonic in terms of the franchise as a whole. The fact is that you're worried about movement. You're worried about looking at Sonic and, dashing from platform to platform, not necessarily, stopping and smelling the roses per se. And the fact is, it does a good job in the overworld structure in terms of creating a world and not necessarily focusing on small details. Now, with that said, there is one drawback to this in terms of the technical aspect, and that's the pop-in. The pop-in is noticeable when you're running around, because the fact is, all of a sudden a tree is there that you didn't see before. Even though you're not running into it, it's far enough in the distance, it is going to cause a surprise for you. And I'm going to be honest, it did distract me at certain times in this game. So I do wish that portion of it was a little bit better, but for all the people who are saying that, it is a technical mess, I don't think it is. Although, let me retract a little bit of that statement, because the performance in terms of the physics engine, there were some times, especially with the camera too, where the game just goes off in the Neverland. And I know that is sort of expected from a Sonic game, but in the first several hours, I really noticed it here, especially with that first boss. There were times where I was like, oh god, what is going on? The physics engine has just, crapped its pants at this point. But to be honest, I sort of expect that from a Sonic game. Now, I know a lot of people use my reviews to determine whether or not to pick up a game, and that's what my whole review system is based off of, a buyability rating. So what would I give it if I stopped playing the game and just went off of what I had now? It would be a mid-70s game. It would be a very niche game, and those who love Sonic and have, played almost every Sonic game, you've already bought the game most likely, and you've already played it. But for those who have, dabbled in Sonic here and there, maybe played Sonic Mania, Sonic Generations, some of the better Sonic games, and want to know if this is worth your time, I do think it is. I think eventually the game that comes from this will be one that most everybody will want to play in terms of getting rid of some of the negatives in terms of the design here and refining it. But for this game right now, if you like the sort of minute-to-minute gameplay of jumping from one thing to the next and just sort of going free and loose and just sort of letting Sonic run where he wants to go, this game will be right up your alley. Granted, it will be dragged down by certain elements, but the fact is that selling point, that sort of running around the open world as Sonic, is the best thing about Sonic Frontiers. Granted, there are a lot of other problems, and if you don't like open world design, guess what? You're going to hate this game because you have a lot of collectibles, a lot of things you have to do. You have to do all these side missions, and some of them you have to do in order to make the story go forward. And if you don't find the way to solve a certain problem, or the game just doesn't give you what you need, you're going to be frustrated and you're going to be like, I hate this game. So if you like open worlds, I think that this game is probably up your alley a little bit. With that said, this is the curse of the Sonic franchise. See, the game is good. It's not great, it's good. And the thing about the modern day video game landscape is that good is not necessarily good enough. There are so many games out there, especially with Xbox Game Pass, especially with some of the Steam sales, that you can wait in a lot of cases and play the game when it's been refined a little bit, when some of the bugs have been hammered out, and appreciate the game later on at the right price. With that said, that also means that the sales figures that they usually base off of in terms of Sega aren't going to be as big, and they may decide to go in a different direction with Sonic, like the last 5 Sonic games. And that's what's going to be frustrating for me, because of the fact that I think this template, this design of Sonic, has so much potential for the future that I really hope whoever is out there on the Sega team that's listening, refine this. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Take the design that you had here, take the notes from people who have, given their opinions, and refine your formula. Because if you refine it, in this case, I think you have a game that could stand on top of the open world mountain. Yes, I am that confident in this design because the highs of this game are very, very high. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. I thank everybody who has made it this far into the video, and I do want to hear your feedback in terms of this format. Yes, this video came out a little later than I wanted it to. I wanted to get it before my parents came down here, but, stuff happened. And the fact is, if this format works for people and I see the sort of, not necessarily engagement, but the statistics on the YouTube side, maybe I'll do this a lot more often with the games that I, stream over on Twitch. Coming up next, actually, I don't know what's coming up next. Lovecraft Untold Stories 2 is probably in the next video, but it's not my main focus. My main focus right now is the 2022 Overlooked Games list. The fact is, over on Twitch, I'll be probably streaming 4 days a week, trying to go through the games that I think are worth looking at before the end of the year. I've got a good amount of them on sale, thank God. But, you know, follow me there. Follow me over on Twitch and see some of those games. And I will be refining that list. I'm hoping to get it done before Christmas. Fingers crossed. But that's it for now. And as always, keep on gaming. And also not having your voice crack.